And we're back. Welcome back to Undoctrinated. I'm Tim and I'm all by myself. You know why? Because this is a bonus episode. Maybe. I don't know really what this is. This is the intro to the Super Bowl episode. And it's a special one, near and dear to my heart. It's me reading Hunter S. Thompson's Fear and Loathing at the Super Bowl. You're going to love this one if you've loved the previous Hunter S. Thompson short stories that I've read. This one falls right in line. It's an ultimate classic. Any Hunter S. Thompson fan has read this one. If you've seen the movie Where the Buffalo Roam with Bill Murray, you've probably seen this part of this story depicted in actual motion picture. I highly recommend go watching that movie. That's a great movie. Anyway, before I get into this episode, I do want to make a brief prediction for the Super Bowl, which is this Sunday. Right now, I'm sitting in my dining room, and it is Tuesday night. I'd like to get this episode up before the end of the month, if possible. That's the goal, anyway. That way I can save all of February's bandwidth for other shit. And, if I get this one up on January 31st, to me, that's right in time for the Super Bowl, just a few days away. So you'll all be able to listen to it instead of watching the Super Bowl. Or you know what? Just play it while you watch the Super Bowl. But anyway, you got the fucking Rams and the Patriots. And if you've been listening to this show for as long as we've been recording it, you know that this has been my Super Bowl prediction the whole fucking time. So that means I'm going to continue to give you some predictions, at least for football. Well, let's face it, for every sport. But you can count on my football predictions. That sure is correct. I've got money on the Rams, so I think maybe my prediction for this actual game may be a little bit biased. I obviously have a rooting interest in this one. I've got $20 on the Rams at 6-1. This was a preseason bet. Pretty sure the Rams have been steady at 6-1 all season, so I think you could have put money on them a couple weeks ago and still got them at 6-1. But anyway, that's where I'm coming from with this prediction. And here's how I see it. Tom Brady has essentially been unsackable for the postseason. I mean, and that's saying a lot because he played in Kansas City, the team that, if I'm not mistaken, led the league in sacks playing at home. Also played against L.A., who's got the two best edge rushers in the league, and they couldn't even get to Brady. So that could be an issue. But I do feel like the Rams have a much better matchup when you look at the defensive line versus the Patriots' offensive line. I think they're going to get to Brady. They're going to disrupt him up the middle. They're going to force him out of the pocket more than anybody's done this entire season. And they're going to eke out a close victory. 28-27. Rams win. Everybody's happy. And I collect on my Vegas bet. And I collect on some fucking Super Bowl squares, hopefully. Got $120 invested in damn Super Bowl squares. So you'll definitely hear about it if I hit any of those. I'm in a fucking $10,000 square pool, so that one there's some winnings to be had there. But anyway, without further ado, let's get into it. Hunter S. Thompson, Fear and Loathing at the Super Bowl. Okay. Let's see. I'm going to turn this mic off. Turn it down. Testing, testing. How do I sound? Okay, that's good enough. All right. Fear and Loathing at the Super Bowl. Grim notes of a failed fan. Mano a mano with the Oakland Raiders. Down and out in Houston. Is pro football over the hump? A vague and vengeful screed on Texas, Jesus, and the political realities of the NFL. Will Ron Ziegler be the next commissioner? And whosoever was not found written into the book of life was cast into the lake of fire. Revelations 2015. This was the theme of the sermon I delivered off the 20th floor balcony of the Hyatt Regency in Houston of the morning of the Super Bowl VIII. It was just before dawn. Oh, thanks a lot. Fantasy alert that I don't need right now because my fantasy season's over. Anyway, sorry, we're reading this off of my phone. It was just before dawn, as I recall, when the urge to speak came on me. Earlier that day, I had found, on the tile floor of the men's room on the hotel mezzanine, a religious comic book titled A Demon's Nightmare, and it was from the text of this sleazy tract that I chose the words of my sermon. The Houston Hyatt Regency, like others designed by architect John Portman in Atlanta and San Francisco, is a stack of 1,000 rooms built around a vast lobby at least 30 stories high, with a revolving spindle-top bar on the roof. The whole center of the building is a tower of acoustical space. You can walk out of any room and look over the indoor balcony, 20 floors down in my case, at the palm-shrouded wood and naga-hide maze of the bar lounge on the lobby floor. Closing time in Houston is 2 a.m. These are the after-hour bars, but the Hyatt Regency is not one of them. So, when I was seized by the urge to deliver my sermon at dawn, there were only about 20 ant-sized people moving around the lobby far below. Earlier, before the bar closed, the whole ground floor had been jammed with drunken sports writers, hard-eyed hookers, wandering geeks, and hustlers of almost every persuasion, and a legion of big and small gamblers from all over the country who roamed through the drunken, randy crowd as casually as possible, with an eye to picking up a last-minute sucker bet from some poor bastard half-mad on booze and willing to put some money, preferably 4 or 5 big ones, on his boys. The spread in Houston was Miami by 6. But by midnight on Saturday, almost every one of the 2,000 or so drunks in the lobby of the Regency, official headquarters and media vortex for this 8th annual Super Bowl, was absolutely sure about what was going to happen when the deal went down on Sunday, about 2 miles east of the hotel, on the fog-soaked artificial turf of Rice University Stadium. Ah, but wait. Why are we talking about gamblers here? Or thousands of hookers and drunken sports writers jammed together in a seething mob in the lobby of a Houston hotel? And what kind of sick and twisted impulse would cause a professional sports writer to deliver a sermon from the book of Revelations off his hotel balcony on the dawn of Super Bowl Sunday? I had not planned a sermon for that morning. I had not even planned to be in Houston for that matter. But now, looking back on that outburst, I see a certain inevitability about it. Probably it was a crazed and futile effort somehow explain the extremely twisted nature of my relationship with God, Nixon, and the National Football League. The three had long since become inseparable in my mind, a sort of unholy trinity that had caused me more trouble and personal anguish in the past few months than Ron Ziegler, Hubert Humphrey, and Peter Sheridan altogether had caused me in a year on the campaign trail. Or perhaps it had something to do with my admittedly deep-seated need to have public revenge on Al Davis, general manager of the Oakland Raiders. Or maybe an overweening desire to confess that I had been wrong, from the start, to have ever agreed with Richard Nixon about anything, and especially pro football. In any case, it was apparently something I had been cranking myself up to deliver for quite a while, and for reasons I still can't be sure of, the eruption finally occurred on the dawn of Super Bowl Sunday. I howled at the top of my lungs for almost 30 minutes, raving and screeching about all those who would soon be cast into the lake of fire for a variety of low crimes, misdemeanors, and general ugliness that amounted to a sweeping indictment of almost everybody in the hotel at that hour. Most of them were asleep when I began speaking, but as a doctor of divinity and an ordained minister in the Church of the New Truth, I knew in my heart that I was merely a vessel, a tool, as it were, of some higher and more powerful voice. For 8 long and degrading days I had skulked around Houston with all the other professionals, doing our jobs, which was actually to do nothing at all except drink all the free booze we could pour into our bodies, courtesy of the National Football League, and listen to an endless barrage of some of the lamest and silliest swill that ever uttered by man or beast. And finally on Sunday morning, about 6 hours before the opening kickoff, I was racked to the point of hysteria by a hellish interior conflict. I was sitting by myself in the room, watching the wind and weather clocks on the TV set, when I felt a sudden, extremely powerful movement at the base of my spine. Mother of sweating Jesus, I thought. What is it, a leech? Are there leeches in this goddamn hotel, along with everything else? I jumped off the bed and began clawing at the small of my back with both hands. The thing felt huge, maybe 8 or 9 pounds, moving slowly up my spine toward the base of my neck. I'd been wondering, all week, why I was feeling so low and out of sorts. But it never occurred to me that a giant leech had been sucking blood out of the base of my spine all that time, and now the goddamn thing was moving up towards the base of my brain, going straight for the medulla. And as a professional sports writer, I knew that if the bugger ever reached my medulla, I was done for. It was at this point that serious conflict set in, because I realized, given the nature of what was coming up my spine, and the drastic effect I knew it would have very soon on my sense of journalistic responsibility, that I would have to do 2 things immediately. First, deliver the sermon that had been brewing in my brain all week long, and then rush back into the room and write my lead for the Super Bowl story. Or maybe write my lead first, and then deliver the sermon. In any case, there was no time to lose. The thing was about 1/3 of the way up my spine now, and still moving at good speed. I jerked on a pair of L.L. Bean's stocking shorts and ran out on the balcony to a nearby ice machine. Back in the room, I filled a glass full of ice and wild turkey, then began flipping through the pages of A Demon's Nightmare for some kind of spiritual springboard to get the sermon moving. I had already decided about midway in the ice run that I had adequate time to address the sleeping crowd, and also crank out a lead before that goddamn blood-sucking slug reached the base of my brain. Or even worse, if a sharp dose of wild turkey happened to slow the thing down long enough to rob me of my final excuse for missing the game entirely like last year. What? Did my tongue slip there? My fingers? Or did I just get a fine professional hint from my old buddy, Mr. Natural? Indeed. When the going gets tough, the tough get going. John Mitchell said that, shortly before he quit his job and left Washington at 90 miles an hour in a chauffeur-driven limousine. I have never felt close to John Mitchell, but on that rotten morning in Houston I came as close as I ever will, because he was, after all, a pro, and so, alas, was I. Or at least I had a fistful of press badges that said I was. And it was this bedrock sense of professionalism, I think, that quickly solved my problem, which, until that moment when I recalled the foul spectre of Mitchell, had seemed to require a frantic decision between either delivering my sermon or writing my lead, in the space of an impossibly short time. When the going gets weird, the weird turn pro. Who said that? I suspect it was somebody from the Columbian Journalism Review, but I have no proof. And it makes no difference anyway. There is a bond among pros that needs no definition, or at least it didn't on that Sunday morning in Houston, for reasons that require no further discussion at this point in time, because it suddenly occurred to me that I had already written the lead for this year's Super Bowl game. I wrote it last year in Los Angeles, and a quick rip through my fat manila folder of clips labeled Football 73 turned it up as if by magic. I jerked it out of the file and retyped it on a fresh page slugged Super Bowl Houston 74. The only change necessary was the substitution of Minnesota Vikings for Washington Redskins. Except for that, the lead seemed just as adequate for the game that I would begin in about 6 hours as it was for the one that I missed in Los Angeles in January of 73. Quote, the precision jackhammer attack of the Miami Dolphins stomped the balls off the Minnesota Vikings today by stomping and hammering with one precise jack thrust after another up the middle, mixed with a pinpoint precision passes into the flat and numerous hammer jack stops around both ends. End quote. The jangling of my telephone caused me to interrupt my work. I jerked it off the hook, saying nothing to whoever was on the other end, and began flashing the hotel operator. When she finally cut in, I spoke very calmly. Look, I said, I'm a very friendly person, and a minister of the gospel to boot. But I thought I left instructions down there to put no calls, goddammit, through to this room, and especially not now in the middle of this orgy. I've been here 8 days and nobody's called me yet. Why in the hell would they start now? What? Well, I simply can't accept that kind of flimsy reasoning, operator. Do you believe in hell? Are you ready to speak with St. Peter? Wait a minute now. Calm down. I want to be sure you understand one thing before I get back to my business. I have some people here who need help. But I want you to know that God is holy. He will not allow sin in his presence. The Bible says, there is none righteous, no, not one. For all I have sinned and come short of the glory of God. That's from the book of Romans, young lady. The silence at the other end of the line was beginning to make me nervous, but I could feel the sap rising, so I decided to continue my sermon from the balcony. And I suddenly realized that somebody was beating on my door. Jesus God, I thought, it's the manager. They've come for me at last. But it was a TV reporter from Pittsburgh, raving drunk and demanding to take a shower. I jerked him into the room. Never mind the goddamn shower, I said. Do you realize what I have on my spine? He stared at me, unable to speak. A giant leech, I said. It's been there for 8 days, getting fatter and fatter with blood. He nodded slowly as I led him over to the phone. I hate leeches, he muttered. That's the least of our problems, I said. Room service won't send any beer up until noon, and all the bars are closed. I have this wild turkey, but I think it's too heavy for the situation we're in. You're right, he said. I got work to do. The goddamn game's about to start. I need a shower. Me too, I said. But I have some work to do first, so you'll have to make the call. Call? He slumped into a chair in the front of the window, staring out at the thick gray mist that had hung on the town for 8 days. Except now, as Super Sunday dawned, it was thicker and wetter than ever. I gave him the phone. Call the manager, I said. Tell him you're Howard Cosell and you're visiting up here with a minister in 2003. We're having a private prayer breakfast, and we need 2/5 of his best red wine, with a box of saltine crackers. He nodded unhappily. Well, I came in here for a shower. Who needs the wine? It's important, I said. You make the call while I go outside and get started. He shrugged and dialed 0, while I hurried out to the balcony, clearing my throat for an opening run at James 2:19. Beware, I shouted, for the devils also believe, and tremble. I waited for a moment, but there was no reply from the lobby 20 floors down, so I tried Ephesians 6:12, which seemed more appropriate. For we wrestle not, I screamed, against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, and yes, against spiritual wickedness in high places. Still, there was no response except for the booming echoes of my own voice. but the thing on my spine was moving with new vigor now, and I sensed there was not much time. All movement in the lobby had ceased. They were all standing around down there, maybe 20 or 30 people, but were they listening? Could they hear? I couldn't be sure. The acoustics of these massive lobbies are not predictable. I knew, for instance, that a person sitting in a room on the 9th floor with the door open could hear, with unnerving clarity, the sound of a cocktail glass shattering on the floor of the lobby. It was also true that almost every word of Greg Allman's Multicolored Lady, played at top volume on a dual-speaker Sony TC-126 in an open-door room on the 20th floor, could be heard in the NFL press room on the hotel mezzanine. But it was hard to be sure of the timbre and carrying power of my own voice in this cavern. It sounded to me like the deep screaming of a bull elk in the rut. But there was no way to know for sure if it was really getting through. "Discipline," I bellowed. "Remember Vince Lombardi?" I paused to let that one sink in, waiting for applause, but none came. "Remember George Metesky?" I shouted. "He had discipline." Nobody down in the lobby seemed to catch that one, although I sensed the first stirrings of action on the balcony just below me. It was almost time for the free breakfast in the Imperial Ballroom downstairs, and some of the early rising sports writers seemed to be up and about. Somewhere behind me a phone was ringing, but I paid no attention. It was time, I felt, to bring it all together. My voice was giving out, but despite the occasional dead spots and bursts of high-pitched wavering, I grasped the railing of the balcony and got braced for some flat-out raving. "Revelations 2015!" I screamed. "Say hallelujah! Yes! Say hallelujah!" People were definitely responding now. I could hear their voices, full of excitement, but the acoustics of the place made it impossible to get a good fix on the cries that were bounding back and forth across the lobby. Were they saying hallelujah? "4 more years," I shouted. "My General Haig has told us that the forces of darkness are now in control of the nation, and they will rule for 4 more years." I paused to sip my drink, and then hit it again. "And Al Davis has told us that whosoever was not found written in the book of life was cast into the lake of fire." I reached around behind me with my free hand, slapping at a spot between my shoulder blades to slow the thing down. "How many of you will be cast into the lake of fire in the next 4 years? How many will survive? I have spoken with General Haig and..." At this point, I was seized by both my arms and jerked backwards, spilling my drink and interrupting the climax of my sermon. "You crazy bastard," a voice screamed. "Look what you've done. The manager just called. Get back in the room and lock the fucking door. He's going to bust us." It was the TV man from Pittsburgh, trying to drag me back from my pulpit. I slipped out of his grasp and returned to the balcony. "This is Super Sunday," I screamed. "I want every one of you worthless bastards down in the lobby in 10 minutes so we can praise God and sing the national anthem." At this point, I noticed the TV man sprinting down the hall towards the elevators, and the sight of him running caused something to snap in my brain. "There he goes," I shouted. "He's headed for the lobby. Watch out! It's Al Davis. He has a knife." I could see people moving on all the balconies now, and also down in the lobby. Then, just before I ducked back in my room, I saw one of the glass-walled elevators starting down, with a single figure inside it. He was the most visible man in the building, a trapped and crazy animal descending slowly, in full view of everybody from the bus boys on the ground floor coffee shop to Jimmy the Greek on the balcony above me, to certain captivity by that ugly crowd at the bottom. I watched for a moment, then hung the "Do Not Disturb" sign on my doorknob and double-locked the door. That elevator, I knew, would be empty when it got to the lobby. There were at least 5 floors on the way down, where he could jump out and bang on a friendly door for safe refuge, and the crowd in the lobby had not seen him clearly enough through the tinted glass wall of the elevator to recognize him later on. And there was not much time for vengeance anyway, on the odd chance that anyone cared. It had been a dull week, even by sports writers' standards, and now the day of the big game was finally on us. Just one more free breakfast, one more ride, and by nightfall the thing would be over. The first media bus was scheduled to leave the hotel for the stadium at 10:30, 4 hours before kickoff. So I figured that gave me some time to relax and act human. I filled the bathtub with hot water, plugged the tape recorder with both speakers into a socket right next to the tub, and spent the next 2 hours in the steam stupor listening to Rosalie Sorrells and Doug Somm, chewing idly on a small slice of Mr. Natural, and reading the cocaine papers of Sigmund Freud. Around noon, I went downstairs to the Imperial Ballroom to read the morning papers over the limp dregs of the NFL free breakfast. Then I stopped at the free bar for a few Bloody Marys before wandering outside to catch the last bus for the stadium, the CBS special, complete with more Bloody Marys, screwdrivers, and a roving wagon meister who seemed to have everything under control. On the bus to the stadium, I made a few more bets on Miami. At that point, I was picking up everything I could get, regardless of the points. It had been a long and jangled night, but the two things that needed to be done before game time, my sermon and my lead, were already done, and the rest of the day looked easy. Just try to keep out of trouble and stay straight enough to collect on all my bets. The consensus among the 1,600 or so sports writers in town favored Miami by almost 2-1. But there are only a handful of sports writers in this country with enough sense to pour piss out of their own boots, and by Saturday night there was an obvious drift among the few smart ones to Minnesota with a 7-point cushion. Paul Zimmerman of the New York Post, author of A Thinking Man's Guide to Pro Football and the sports writing fraternity's scaled-down answer to the Washington Post political guru, David Broder, had organized this traditional press room betting pool, where any sports writer who felt up to it could put $1 in the pot and predict the final score, in writing on the press room bulletin board, for all the world to see, and whoever came closest would pick up $1,000 or so. Or at least that was the theory. But in reality, there were only about 400 writers willing to risk a public prediction on the outcome of a game that, even to an amateur like me, was so obvious that I took every bet I could get against the Vikings, regardless of the spread. As late as 10:30 on Sunday morning, I was calling bookies on both coasts, doubling and tripling my bets with every point I could get from 5 to 7. And by 2:35 on Sunday afternoon, 5 minutes after the kickoff, I knew I was home free. Moments later, when the Dolphins drove the length of the field for another touchdown, I began collecting money. The final outcome was painfully clear less than halfway through the first quarter, and shortly after that, Sport Magazine editor Dick Schaap reached over my shoulder in the press section and dropped 2 bills, a 5 and a 20, in my lap. I smiled back at him. "Jesus," I said, "are you giving up already? This game is far from over, my man. Your people are only 21 points down, and we still have a whole half to go." He shook his head sadly. "You're not counting on a second half rally?" I asked, pocketing his money. He stared at me, saying nothing. Then he rolled his eyes up towards the soupy mist above the stadium where the Goodyear blimp was hovering, almost invisible in the fog. When I began this doom-struck story many months ago, the idea was to follow one team all the way to the Super Bowl, and, in the process, try to document the alleged, or at least Nixonian, similarities between pro football and politics. The problem at that time was to decide which team to follow. It had to be one with a good chance of going all the way, and also a team I could get along with over an extended period of time. That was in early November, and the list of possibilities included about half the league, but I narrowed it down to the 4 teams where I already knew some of the players: Los Angeles, Miami, Washington, and Oakland. And after many days of brooding, I chose Oakland. There were 2 main factors involved. One, I had already made a large bet at 8-1 odds on Oakland to go all the way, as opposed to a 4-1 bet on the Redskins and 2-1 against Miami. And 2, When I checked with Dave Bergen, a former San Francisco Examiner and Washington Star News sports editor, he said there were only 2 teams in the whole league flaky enough for me to identify with in any kind of personal or human way. One was Pittsburgh and the other was Oakland. Well, it is 3 months later now, and the question that still haunts me is, which jail, morgue, or asylum would I be in today if I'd happened to pick one of the other teams? Even now, almost 2,000 miles and 2 months removed from the Raider headquarters in Oakland, I still want to reach for an ice pick every time I see a football. And my only consolation, looking back on that nightmare, is that I might have decided to cover the Dallas Cowboys. Just before talking to Bergen, in fact, I read a savage novel called North Dallas 40 by ex-Cowboy flanker Pete Gent, and it had cranked up my interest in both Dallas and the Cowboys, enough so that I was right on the brink of dumping Oakland and heading for Texas. Fortunately, I was shrewd enough to choose Oakland, a decision that resulted, less than 3 weeks after I made it, in a series of personal and professional disasters ranging from massive slander and a beating by a stadium cop outside the Raiders' dressing room, to total banishment from the field, locker room, press box, and for all practical purposes, because of the dark assumptions that would inevitably be made about any player seen with me in public, from any bar, restaurant, zoo, or shotgun store in the Bay Area frequented by any Raiders players. The reason for all this are still not entirely clear. Or maybe they are, and I still can't grasp the real meaning of what happened. Perhaps it was merely a case of the chickens coming home to roost, accompanied by 3 giant condors. Part 2. The Raiders kicked you out? For what? Drug rumors? Well, it's nice to know they're starting to give writers the same kind of underhanded chicken shit they've been laying on players for 10 years. Yeah, it varies from team to team. Like, for me, getting traded to Pittsburgh after all that time in Oakland was like finally coming up for air. As a matter of general philosophy, though, the National Football League is the last bastion of fascism in America. Tom Keating, defensive tackle for the Pittsburgh Steelers. To reach the Oakland Raiders practice field, you drive from San Francisco across the Bay Bridge and then south on US 17 to exit 98 at Hegenberger Road at the south end of Alameda Bay. Turn right at the off-ramp that leads to the Oakland International Airport. Glance back at the Edgewater Inn and the squat white concrete block building right next to the Edgewater that says Oakland Raiders. And then swing north again. About 6 miles past the airport entrance, the Oakland Hilton, and a speedboat raceway, the road gets narrow and seems to be heading downhill through a wet desert of stunted jack pines, or scrub oaks, or whatever they call those useless little trees that grow on the edge of swamplands all over the country, near places like Pensacola and Portland. But this is Oakland, or at least San Leandro, and when you drive 20 miles out of San Francisco to a lonesome place like this, you want a pretty good reason, or at least a decent excuse. The only people who make this run regularly in the autumn months between late August and September are Bay Area sports writers and people on the payroll of the Oakland Raiders, players, trainers, coaches, owners, etc. And the only reason they make this trip day after day is the nervous fact that the Raiders' practice field and daily headquarters is located, for good or ill, out here on this stinking estuary across the bay from San Francisco. It is a hard place to find unless you know exactly where to look. The only sure giveaway sign from the highway is a sudden rise of thin steel scaffolding looming out of the jack pines about 200 yards west of the road, and 2 men in cheap plastic ski jackets on a platform at the top of the tower, aiming big gray movie cameras down at whatever's happening on the other side of that tree fence. Turn left just beyond the film tower, park in a muddy lot full of new Cadillacs and flashy sports cars, and walk up a grassy bank to a 1-story concrete block building that looks like a dog kennel or a Pepsi Cola warehouse in St. Louis. push through a big metal fire door, and along a naked corridor decorated on both sides with black and gray helmets, sharp-edged footballs, red, white, and blue NFL stickers, and finally around a corner into the weight room, a maze of fantastically complicated machinery with signs all around warning unauthorized persons to keep their goddamn hands off of everything. One of the weight machines costs $6,500 and is designed to do nothing but stretch knots out of trapezius muscles. Another, costing $8,800, is a maze of steel cables, weights, and ankle hooks that will, if properly used, cure kinks, rips, and contusions of every muscle from the hip to the Achilles tendon. There are other machines for problems of the feet, neck, and elbows. I was tempted to get physically involved with every machine in the building, just to know how it felt to get jerked around by all that fantastic machinery. I was also tempted to speak with the trainers and sample whatever medications they had to offer, but pro football locker rooms are no longer the wholesale drug dispensaries that they were in the past. National Football League Commissioner Pete Rozelle, along with President Nixon and the network TV moguls, have determined that drugs and pro football won't mix, at least not in public. On my first visit to the locker room, and on all other visits for that matter, I avoided both the weight machines and the trainers. There was no point, I felt, in compromising the story early on, although if I had known what kind of ship train I was heading into, I would have sprung every machine in the building and gobbled every pill I could get my hands on. But I felt a certain obligation back then to act in a professional manner, and besides, for my first look at the Raiders' practice field, I was accompanied by a friendly little fellow named Al Locasal, who had told me when I called on the phone that he was executive assistant to the Raiders' general manager and would-be owner, Al Davis. Locasal led me through the locker room, past the weights and the trainers, and out through another small door that opened onto a long green pasture enclosing 2 football fields, 4 goal posts, many blocking sleds and tackling dummies, and about 60 men moving around very actively, gathered in 4 separate groups on both fields. I recognized John Madden, the head coach, running the offensive unit through short pass drills on the field to my right, and on the other field, about 50 yards to my left, another coach was running the defensive unit through some kind of drill I couldn't recognize. Far down at the other end of the field, where the defensive unit was working, I could see George Blanda, the Raiders' 46-year-old reserve quarterback and premier place kicker, working with his own set of handlers and banging one kick after another through the uprights from the 30 or 35-yard line. Blanda and his small crew were paying no attention to what was happening on the offensive and defensive fields. Their job was to keep George sharp on field goals, and during the 2 hours I was there that afternoon, he kicked at least 40 or 50, and I never saw him miss one. There were 2 other solitary figures moving around on the fields beyond the small enclosures near the locker room door where Locasale and several assistants made sure the half-dozen local sports writers stayed. One was Ray Guy, the rookie punter and number 1 draft choice from Mississippi, who spent all afternoon kicking one ball after another in tall, spiraling arcs above the offensive unit to a brace of ball boys just in front of the sports writers' huddle. And the other was a small, wiry man in a tan golf jacket with a greasy ducktail haircut, who paced along the sidelines of both fields with a speedy kind of intensity that I never really noticed until he suddenly appeared very close to me, and I heard him ask a sports writer from the San Francisco Chronicle who I was and what I was doing there. The conversation took place within 10 yards of me, and I heard most of it. "Who's the big guy over there with the ball in his hand?" asked the man with the DA. "His name's Thompson," replied Chronicle sports writer Jack Smith. "He's a writer for Rolling Stone." "Rolling Stones? Jesus Christ, what's he doing here? Did you bring him?" "No, he's writing a big article. Rolling Stone is a magazine, Al. It's different from the Rolling Stones. They're a rock music group. Thompson's a buddy of George Plimpton's, I think. And he's also a friend of Dave Bergen's. You remember Bergen?" Holy shit, Bergen! We ran him out of here with a cattle prod. I saw Smith laugh at that point. Then he was talking again. Don't worry, Al. Thompson's okay. He wrote a good book about Las Vegas. Good God, I thought. That's it. If they read that book, I'm finished. By this time, I'd realized that this strange-looking bugger named Al, who looked like a pimp or a track tout, was in fact the infamous Al Davis, general manager and de facto owner, pending settlement of a nasty lawsuit scheduled for court action early this year, of the whole Oakland Raider operation. Davis glanced over his shoulder at me, then spoke back to Smith. Get the bastard out of here. I don't trust him. I heard that very clearly, and if I'd had any sense, I'd have abandoned the whole story right then, for reasons of extreme and unnatural prejudice. Call the office and say I couldn't handle the bad vibes, then jump the next plane to Colorado. I was watching Davis very closely now, and it occurred to me that the fiendish intensity of his speech and mannerisms reminded me very strongly of another Oakland badass I'd spent some time with several years earlier, ex-Hells Angels president Ralph Sonny Barger, who had just beaten a multiple murder rap and then copped out, they said, to some kind of minor charge like aggravated assault with intent to commit murder, or possession of automatic weapons, submachine guns, possession of heroin, 4 pounds, with intent to sell, and sexual assault on 2 minors with intent to commit forcible sodomy. I had read these things in the Chronicle, but what the hell? Why compound these libels? Any society that will put Barger in jail and make Al Davis a respectable millionaire at the same time is not a society to be trifled with. In any case, the story of my strange and officially ugly relationship with Al Davis is too complicated for any long explanations at this point. I spent several days pacing the sidelines of the Raiders practice field with him, prior to the Pittsburgh, Cleveland, and Kansas City games, and the only thing I remembered him talking about is environmental determinism. He spoke at considerable length on that subject, as I recall, but there is nothing in my notes to indicate precisely what he said about it. Shortly after I heard him tell Smith to get rid of me on that first afternoon, I walked over to him and somehow got wound up in a conversation about how he was having trouble buying property in Aspen because, quote, some people out there thought his money was dirty because of his known connections in Las Vegas. Hell, that's no problem, I told him. I once ran for sheriff in Aspen. I know the place pretty well. And I can tell you that for sure that at least half the money out there is dirtier than any you're likely to come up with. He stopped and eyed me curiously. You ran for sheriff, he said? In Aspen, Colorado? I nodded. Yeah, but I'd rather not talk about it. We didn't lose by much, but losing in politics is like losing in football, right? 1 vote, 1 point. He smiled crookedly, then began pacing again. I don't give a damn about politics, he said as I hurried along the white lime sideline to keep up with him. The only thing that interests me are economics and foreign affairs. Jesus Christ, I thought, economics and foreign affairs. Environmental determinism? This bastard is sandbagging me. We paced back and forth a while longer. Then he suddenly turned on me. What are you after? He snapped. Why are you out here? Well, I said, it would take me a while to explain it. Why don't we have a beer after practice tomorrow and all? Not tomorrow, he said quickly. I only come out here on Wednesdays and Thursdays. They get nervous when I'm around, so I try to stay away most of the time. I nodded, but I didn't really understand what he meant until an hour or so later, when Coach Madden signaled the end of that day's practice, and Davis suddenly rushed onto the field and grabbed the quarterback, Ken Stabler, along with a receiver and a defensive back I didn't recognize, and made them run the same pass pattern, a quick shot from about 15 yards out, with the receiver getting the ball precisely at the corner of the goal line and the out-of-bounds line at least 12 consecutive times until they had it down, exactly the way he wanted it. That was my last real memory of Al Davis. It was getting dark in Oakland. The rest of the team had already gone into the showers. The coach was inside, speaking sagely with a gaggle of local sports writers. Somewhere beyond the field fence, a big jet was cranking up its afterburners on the airport runway. And here was the owner of the flakiest team in pro football, running around on a half-dark practice field like a King Hill speed freak with his quarterback and two other key players, insisting that they run the same goddamn play over and over again until they had it right. That was the only time I ever felt that I really understood Davis. We talked on other days, sort of loosely and usually about football. Whenever I would show up at a practice field and pace around the sidelines with him, and it was somewhere around the third week of my random appearances, as I recall, that he began to act very nervous whenever he saw me. I never asked why, but it was clear that something had changed, if only back to normal. After one of the midweek practices, I was sitting with one of the Raiders players in the tavern down the road from the field house, and he said, "Jesus, I was walking back to the huddle and I looked over and saw, I was walking back to the huddle and looked over and, goddamn, I almost flipped when I saw you and Davis standing together on the sideline. I thought, man, the world is really changing when you see a thing like that. Hunter Thompson and Davis. Christ, that's the first time I ever saw anybody with Davis during practice. The bastard's always alone out there, just pacing back and forth like a goddamn beast." In the meantime, blissfully unaware of what was about to happen, I was trying to learn as much as possible about the real underbelly of pro football by watching a film of the Denver-Dallas game with several Raiders players who provided a running commentary on the action, trying to explain, in language as close as they could cut it for the layman's slow eye, what was happening on the screen and how it might or might not relate to the Denver-Oakland game coming up next Sunday. The purpose of the film session was to show me some of the things, in slow motion and repeated instant replay, that nobody in the stands or the press box will ever understand. It was done as a personal favor, at a time when neither I nor any of the Oakland players realized that I was about to be banished. If I'd been writing a story on Evel Knievel at the time, I would have asked him to do the same thing, sit down for an evening with some films of his jumps, and explain each one step by step, along with whatever was going through his head at any given moment. What follows then is a random commentary by some pro football players just a few games away from the Super Bowl, watching a film of a game between two teams, one of which they will have to beat on Sunday to make the playoffs, and another they might have to beat in the Super Bowl itself. The film we were watching was the Denver-Dallas game on December 2nd. Dallas won 22-10, which hardly matters because pro football players don't watch game films to see who won or lost. They watch for patterns, tendencies, and individual strengths or weaknesses. And in this case, they were trying to translate their reactions into language I could get a personal grip on, which accounts for some of the awkward moments. Under normal circumstances, I'd identify all of the voices in this heavily edited tape transcript. But for the reasons that will soon become obvious, if they aren't already, I decided that it would probably be more comfortable for all of us if I lumped all the player voices under one name, Raider. This takes a bit of an edge off the talk, but it also makes it hard for the NFL security watchdogs to hassle some good people and redline their names for hanging around with a dope fiend. Part 3. Do not mistake me for any other reader. I have come here to help to save the suffering. You know God works in a mysterious way. If you have faith in God, don't fail to see. Mother Roberts, psychic reader and advisor, the one and only gifted healer, was born with the God-given powers to help humanity and has devoted her life to this work. Tells your friends and enemies names without asking a single word. She will tell you what you wish to know regarding health, marriage, love, divorce, courtship, speculations, and business transactions of all kinds. She will tell you of any changes you should or shouldn't make, good or bad. She removes evil influences and bad luck of all kinds. She never fails to unite the separated, cause speedy and happy marriages. She lifts you out of sorrow and darkness and starts you on the way to success and happiness. She will give sound and important advice on all affairs of life, whatever they may be. You will find her superior to any other reader you have consulted in the past. A place to bring your friends and feel no embarrassment. Half price with this slip, open daily and Sundays, 8 a.m. to 10 p.m., 1609 West Alabama. Phone JA 3-2297. No appointment necessary. Look for address. Ah, yes, Mother Roberts. I found her card on the bus and jammed it into one of my pockets, thinking that maybe I could give her a call on Monday and make an appointment. I had a lot of heavy questions to lay on her, like, why am I here, Mother Roberts? What does it all mean? Have I finally turned pro? Can this really be the end? Down and out in Houston with... No, I was just kidding, Mother Roberts. Just putting you on. Just working a bit of a test on you, right? Yes, because what I was really leading up to is this extremely central question. No, I'm not shy. It's just that I come from way up north where people's lips are frozen about 10 months every year. So we don't get used to talking until very late in life. What? Old? Well, I think you just put your finger on your wand or whatever, right smack on the head of the nail, Mother Roberts. Because the god-awful truth of the whole matter is that I've been feeling extremely old this past week. And... What? Wait a minute now, goddammit. I'm still getting up to the main question, which is... What? No, I never curse. Mother Roberts. That was a cry of anguish, a silent scream from the soul, because I feel in serious trouble down here in this goddamn town, and... Yes, I am a white person, Mother Roberts, and we both know there's not a damn thing you can do about it. Are you prejudiced? No, let's not get into that. Just let me ask you this question. And if you can give me a straight and reasonable answer, I promise I won't come out to your place. Because what I want you to tell me, Mother Roberts, and I mean this very seriously, is why have I been in Houston for 8 days without anybody offering me some cocaine? Yes, cocaine, that's what I said. And just between you and me, I'm damn serious about wanting some. What? Drugs? Of course I'm talking about drugs. Your ad said you can answer some questions and lift me out of sorrow and darkness. Okay, I'm listening. Yeah. But let me tell you something, Mother Roberts. My name is Al Davis, and I'm the editor of Reader's Digest. Right, I can have you busted right now for false advertising. Yeah, well, I think I might pick up some of my people and come out to see you later on today. We want some explanations for this kind of antichrist bullshit. This country's in enough trouble, goddammit, without people like you running around selling drugs like cocaine to people in serious trouble. Mother Roberts hung up on me at that point. Christ only knows what she thought was about to come down on her when dusk fell in Houston. Here was the editor of the Reader's Digest coming out to her house with a goon squad, and all of them apparently stone mad for cocaine and vengeance. A terrible situation. It was not until Monday afternoon that I actually spoke with Mother Roberts on the telephone, but the idea of going over to Galveston and dealing with the whole super scene story from some rotten motel on the edge of the seawall had been wandering around in my head almost from the first hour after I checked into my coveted press room at the Hyatt Regency. And, in dull retrospect now, I wish I had done that. Almost anything would have been better than that useless week I spent in Houston waiting for the big game. The only place in town where I felt at home was a sort of sporadically violent strip joint called the Blue Fox, far out in the country on South Main. Nobody I talked to in Houston had ever heard of it, and the only 2 sports writers who went out there with me got involved in a wild riot that ended up with all of us getting maced by undercover vice squad cops who just happened to be in the middle of the action when it erupted. Ah, but that is another story, and we don't have time for it here. Maybe next time. There are two untold sagas that will not fit into this story. One has to do with Big Al's cactus room in Oakland, and the other concerns the Blue Fox in Houston. There is also, at least in the minds of at least 24 gullible sports writers at the Super Bowl, the ugly story of how I spent 3 or 4 days prior to Super Week shooting smack in a $7 a night motel room on the seawall in Galveston. I remember telling that story one night in the press lounge at the Hyatt Regency, just babbling it off the top of my head out of sheer boredom. Then I forgot about it completely until one of the local sports writers approached me a day or so later and said, "Say, man, I hear you spent some time in Galveston last week." "Galveston?" "Yeah," he said. "I hear you locked yourself in a motel over there and shot heroin for 3 days." I looked around me to see who was listening, then grinned kind and stupidly and said, "Shucks, there wasn't much else to tell, you know. So why not get loaded in Galveston?" He shrugged uncontrollably and looked down at his old crow and water. I glanced at my watch and turned to leave. "Time to hit it," I said with a smile. "See you later, when I'm feeling back on my rails." He nodded glumly as I moved away in the crowd, and although I saw him 3 or 4 times a day for the rest of that week, he never spoke to me again. Most sports writers are so blank on the subject of drugs that you can only talk to them about it at your own risk, which is easy enough for me because I get a boot out of seeing their eyes bulge. But it can be disastrous to a professional football player who makes the casual mistake of assuming that a sports writer knows what he's talking about when he uses a word like crank. Any professional athlete who talks to a sports writer about drugs, even the best and most constructive intentions, is taking a very heavy risk. There is a definite element of hysteria about drugs of any kind in pro football today, and a casual remark, even a meaningless remark, across the table in a friendly hometown bar can lead, very quickly, to a seat in the witness chair in front of a congressional committee. Ah, drugs. That word again. It was a hard word to avoid in NFL circles last year, like the missile gap in 1960, in the 1960 Kennedy-Nixon election, or Law and Order in 1968. 1973 was a pretty dull press year for congressmen. The Senate's Watergate Committee had managed somehow to preempt most of the ink and airtime, and one of the few congressmen who managed to lash his own special gig past that barrier was an apparently senile 67-year-old ex-sheriff and football coach from West Virginia named Harley Staggers. Somewhere in the spastic interim between John Dean and Bob Haldeman, Congressman Staggers managed to collar some story-starved sports writer from the New York Times long enough to announce that his committee, the House Subcommittee on Investigations, had stumbled on such a king-hell wasp's nest of evidence in the course of their probe into the use of drugs by athletes that the committee was prepared, or almost prepared, pending further evidence, to come to grips with their natural human duty and offer up a law very soon that would require individual urinalysis tests on all professional athletes, and especially pro football players. These tests would be administered by professional urinalysts, paid by the federal government out of tax monies. And if any one of these evil bastards, passed urine that turned red, or green, or blue, or whatever, they would be, well, the Staggers Committee is still mulling on the question of penalties. Maybe studying is a better word. Or pondering. That's right, they're still pondering it. And God's mercy on any muscle-bound degenerate whose piss turns red if Harley ever passes his law. The rumor on Capitol Hill is that Rep. Staggers is even now in the process of arranging for the construction of a model, medium-security jock drug penitentiary and rehabilitation center on the site of an abandoned missile base near Tonopah, Nevada. Meanwhile, the President of the United States has been lashed out of office and disbarred in his home state of Maryland. The President himself is teetering on the brink of a burglary conspiracy indictment that will mean certain impeachment, and the whole structure of our government has become a stagnant mockery of itself and everybody who ever had faith in it. What all this means to Harley Staggers is hard to say. I am tempted to call him. It is 7:02 in Washington, and I suspect he is wide awake, administering the daily beating to his pit bulls in the backyard garage and waiting for calls from reporters. "What's up, Harley? Who's gonna get it?" "Well, let me say this. We know for a fact that the situation is out of control, and I mean to put a stop to it, or I'll down or fall down trying." "A stop to what, Harley?" "Never mind that. You know what I mean?" "Let me ask you something. Does a phrase like the playing fields of West Virginia mean anything to you?" "Wait a minute. Where were you raised?" "What's wrong with click?" Ah, Jesus, another bad tangent. Somewhere in the back of my mind, I recall signing a contract that said I would never do this kind of thing again. One of the conditions of my turning pro was a clause about swearing off gibberish. But like Greg Allman says, I've wasted so much time feeling guilty. There is some kind of backdoor connection in my head between Super Bowls and the Allman Brothers. A strange kind of theme sound that haunts these goddamn stories, no matter where I'm finally forced into a corner to write them. The Allman sound and rain. There was heavy rain last year on the balcony of my dim-lit hotel room just down from the Sunset Strip in Hollywood, and more rain through the windows of the San Francisco office buildings where I finally typed out the story. And now, almost exactly a year later, my main memory of Super Bowl 8 in Houston is rain and gray mist outside another hotel window, with the same strung-out sound of the Allman Brothers booming out of the same portable speakers that I had last year in Los Angeles. There was not much else worth remembering from either game, or at least not much that needs writing about, and the clock on the wall reminds me once again that a final deadline looms, and there is hungry space to fill out there in San Francisco, which means no more thinking about rain and music, but a quick and nasty regression into professionalism. Which is what it's all about. Indeed, I tend more and more to forget these things, or maybe just to ignore them. But what the hell, retirement is just around the corner, so why not wander a bit? You grow up fast in Texas, and you got to lay it down, or you'll be working for somebody way across town. Doug Somm. The floor of the Hyatt Regency's men's room was always covered, about 3 inches deep, with discarded newspapers, all apparently complete and unread, except on closer examination you realized that every one of them was missing its sports section. This bathroom was right next to the hotel newsstand, and just across the mezzanine from the crowded NFL press lounge, a big room full of telephones and free booze, where most of the 1,600 or so sports writers assigned to cover the big game seemed to spend about 16 hours of each day during Super Week. After the first day or so, when it became balefully clear that there was no point in anybody except the local reporters going out on the press bus each day for the carefully staged player interviews that Dolphin tackle Manny Fernandez described as like going to the dentist every day to have the same tooth filled. The out-of-town writers began using the local types as a sort of involuntary pool, which was more like an old British Navy press gang, in fact, because the locals had no choice. They would go out each morning to the Miami and Minnesota team hotels and dutifully conduct the daily interviews, and about 2 hours later this mass of useless gibberish would appear, word for word, in the early editions of either the Post or the Chronicle. You could see the front door of the hotel from the balcony of the press lounge, and whenever the newsboy came in with his stack of fresh papers, the national writers would make the long 48-yard walk across to the newsstand and cough up 15 cents each for their copies. Then on the way back to the press lounge, they would stop for a piss and dump the whole paper, except for the crucial sports section, on the floor of the men's room. The place was so deep all week in fresh newsprint that it was sometimes hard to push the door open. 40 yards away on comfortable couches surrounding the free bar, the national gents would spend about 2 hours each day scanning the local sports sections, along with a never-ending mass of almost psychotically detailed information churned out by the NFL publicity office, on the dim chance of finding something worth writing about that day. There never was, of course, but nobody seemed really disturbed about it. The only thing most of the sports writers in Houston seemed to care about was having something to write about. Anything at all. Boss, a peg, an angle, a quote, even a goddamn rumor. I remember being shocked at the sloth and moral degeneracy of the Nixon press corps during the 1972 presidential campaign. But they were like a pack of wolverines on speed compared to the relatively elite sports writers who showed up in Houston to cover the Super Bowl. On the other hand, there really was no story. As the week wore on, it became increasingly obvious that we were all just working here. Nobody knew who to blame for it, and although at least a third of the sports writers who showed up for that super expensive shuck knew exactly what was happening, I doubt if more than 5 or 6 of them ever actually wrote the cynical and contemptuous appraisals of Super Bowl VIII that dominated about half the conversations around the bar and the press lounge. Whatever was happening in Houston that week had little or nothing to do with the hundreds of stories that were sent out on the news wires each day. Most of the stories, in fact, were unabashed rewrites of the dozens of official NFL press releases churned out each day by the league publicity office. Most of the stories about fantastic parties given by Chrysler, American Express, and Jimmy the Greek were taken from press releases and rewritten by people who had spent the previous evening at least 5 miles from the scenes described in their stories. The NFL's official Super Bowl party, the incredible Texas Hoedown, on Friday night in the Astrodome, was as wild, glamorous, and exciting as an Elks Club picnic on Tuesday in Salina, Kansas. The official NFL press release on the Hoedown said it was an unprecedented extravaganza that cost the league more than $100,000 and attracted people like Gene McCarthy and Ethel Kennedy. Which might have been true, but I spent about 5 hours skulking around in that grim concrete barn, and the only people I recognized were a dozen or so sports writers from the press lounge. Anybody with access to a mimeograph machine and a little imagination could have generated at least 1,000 articles on an orgy of indescribable proportions at John Connolly's house, with Allen Ginsberg as the guest of honor and 13 thoroughbred horses slaughtered by drug-crazed guests with magnesium butcher knives. Most of the press people would have simply picked the story off the table in the workroom, rewritten it just enough to make it sound genuine, and sent it off on the wire without a second thought. The bus ride to the stadium for the game on Sunday took more than an hour due to heavy traffic. I had made the same 6-mile drive the night before in just under 5 minutes, but that was under very different circumstances. Rice Stadium is on South Main Street, along the same route that led from the Hyatt Regency to the Dolphin headquarters at the Marriott, and also to the Blue Fox. There was not much to do on the bus except drink, smoke, and maintain a keen ear on the babble of conversations behind me for any talk that might signal the presence of some late-blooming Viking fan with money to waste. It is hard to stay calm and casual in a crowd of potential bettors when you feel absolutely certain of winning any bet you can make. At that point, anybody with even a hint of partisan enthusiasm in his voice becomes a possible mark, a doomed and ignorant creature to be lured as carefully as possible into some disastrous last-minute wager that could cost him every dollar he owns. There is no room for mercy or the milk of human kindness in football betting, at least not when you're prepared to get up on the edge with every dollar you own. One-on-one betting is a lot more interesting than dealing with bookies, because it involves strong elements of personality and psychic leverage. Betting against the point spread is a relatively mechanical trip, but betting against another individual can be very complex if you're serious about it, because you want to know, for starters, whether you're betting against a fool or a wizard, or maybe against somebody who's just playing the fool. Making a large bet on a bus full of sports writers on the way to the Super Bowl, for instance, can be a very dangerous thing because you might be dealing with somebody who was in the same fraternity at Penn State with one of the team doctors, and who learned the night before, while drinking heavily with his old buddy, that the quarterback you're basing your bet on has 4 cracked ribs and can barely raise his passing arm to shoulder level. Situations like these are not common. Unreported injuries can lead to heavy fines against any team that fails to report one, especially in a Super Bowl. But what is a $10,000 fine compared to the amount of money that kind of crucial knowledge is worth against a big-time bookie? The other side of that coin is a situation where a shrewd coach turns the league's report all injuries rule into a psychological advantage for his own team, and coincidentally for any bettor who knows what's happening by scrupulous reporting an injury to a star player just before the game, then calling a press conference to explain that the just reported injury is of such a nature, a pulled muscle for instance, that it might or might not heal entirely by game time. This was what happened in Houston with the Dolphins' Paul Warfield, widely regarded as the most dangerous pass receiver in football. Warfield is a game breaker, a man who commands double coverage at all times because of his antelope running style, twin magnets for hands, and a weird kind of adrenaline instinct that feeds on tension and high pressure. There is no more beautiful sight in football than watching Paul Warfield float out of the backfield on a sort of angle streak pattern right into the heart of a perfect zone defense and take a softly thrown pass on his hip without even seeming to notice the arrival of the ball, and then float another 60 yards into the end zone, with none of the frustrated defensive backs ever touching him. There is an eerie kind of certainty about Warfield's style that is far more demoralizing than just another 6 points on the scoreboard. About half the time he looks bored and lazy, but even the best pass defenders in the league know, in some nervous corner of their hearts, that when the deal goes down, Warfield is capable of streaking right past them like they didn't exist. Unless he's hurt, playing with some kind of injury that might or might not be serious enough to either slow him down or gimp the fiendish concentration that makes him so dangerous. And this was the possibility that Dolphins coach Don Shula raised on Wednesday when he announced that Warfield had pulled a leg muscle in practice that afternoon and might not play on Sunday. This news caused instant action in gambling circles. Even big-time bookies, whose underground information on these things is usually as good as Pete Rozell's, took Shula's announcement seriously enough to cut the spread down from 7 to 6, a decision worth many millions of betting dollars if the game turned out to be close. Even the rumor of an injury to Warfield was worth 1 point, and even 2 with some bookies I was never able to locate. And if Shula had announced on Saturday that Paul was definitely not going to play, the spread would probably have dropped to 4 or even 3, because the guaranteed absence of Warfield would have taken a great psychological load off the minds of Minnesota defensive backs. Without the ever-present likelihood of a game-breaking bomb at any moment, they could focus down much tighter on stopping Miami's brutal running game, which eventually destroyed them, just as it had destroyed Oakland's nut-cutting defense 2 weeks earlier. And one of the main reasons why the Vikings failed to stop the Dolphins on the ground was the constant presence of Paul Warfield in his customary wide receiver spot. He played almost the whole game, never showing any sign of injury, and although he caught only 1 pass, he neutralized 2 Minnesota defensive backs on every play, and 2 extra tacklers on the line of scrimmage might have made a hell of a difference in that embarrassingly decisive first quarter, when Miami twice drove what might as well have been the whole length of the field to score 14 quick points and crack the Vikings' confidence just as harshly as they had cracked the Redskins out in Los Angeles a year earlier. It is hard to say, even now, exactly why I was so certain of an easy Dolphin victory. The only reason I didn't get extremely rich on the game was my inability to overcome the logistical problems of betting heavily on credit by means of frantic long-distance phone calls from a hotel in Houston. None of the people I met in that violent, waterlogged town were inclined to introduce me to a reliable bookmaker, and the people I called on both coasts several hours before the game on Sunday morning seemed unnaturally nervous when I asked them to use their own credit to guarantee my bets with their local bookies. Looking back on it now, after talking with some of these people and cursing them savagely, I see that the problem had something to do with my frenzied speech pattern that morning. I was still in the grip of whatever fiery syndrome had caused me to deliver that sermon off the balcony a few hours earlier, and the hint of mad tremor in my voice, despite all attempts to disguise it, was apparently communicated very clearly to all those I spoke with on the long-distance telephone. How long, O Lord, how long? This is the second year in a row that I have gone to the Super Bowl and been absolutely certain, at least 48 hours before game time, of the outcome. It is also the second year in a row that I have failed to capitalize financially on this certainty. Last year, betting mainly with wealthy cocaine addicts, I switched all my bets from Washington to Miami on Friday night, and in the resulting confusion my net winnings were almost entirely canceled by widespread rancor and personal bitterness. This year, in order to sidestep that problem, I waited until the last moment to make my bets, despite the fact that I knew the Vikings were doomed after watching them perform for the press at their star-crossed practice field on Monday afternoon before the game. It was clear even then that they were spooked and very uncertain about what they were getting into, but it was not until I drove about 20 miles around the Beltway to the other side of town for a look at the Dolphins that I knew for sure how to bet. There are a lot of factors intrinsic to the nature of the Super Bowl that make it far more predictable than regular season games, or even playoffs. But they are not the kind of factors that can be sensed or understood at a distance of 2,000 or even 20 miles, on the basis of any wisdom or information that filters out from the sight through those red, rose-colored, booze-bent media filter that passes for wild, worldwide coverage at these spectacles. There is a progression of understanding vis-a-vis pro football that varies drastically from the factor of distance, physical, emotional, intellectual, and every other way, which is exactly the way it should be, in the eyes of the amazingly small number of people who own and control the game, because it is this finely managed distance factor that accounts for the high-profit mystique that blew the sacred institution of baseball off its national pastime pedestal in less than 15 years. There were other reasons for baseball's precipitous loss of popularity among everybody except old men and middle-aged sports writers between 1959 and now, just as there will be a variety of reasons to explain the certain decline of pro football between now and 1984. But if sporting historians ever look back on all this and try to explain it, there will be no avoiding the argument that pro football's meteoric success in the 1960s was directly attributable to its early marriage with network TV and a huge coast-to-coast audience of armchair fans who grew up, in terms of their personal relationship to the game, with the idea that pro football was something that happened every Sunday on the tube. The notion of driving 8 miles along a crowded freeway and then paying $3 to park the car in order to pay another $10 to watch the game from the vantage point of a damp redwood bench 55 rows above the 19-yard line in a crowd of noisy drunks was entirely repugnant to them. And they were absolutely right. After 10 years of trying it both ways, and especially after watching this last wretched Super Bowl game from a choice seat in the press section, very high above the 50-yard line, I hope to Christ I never again succumb to whatever kind of weakness or madness it is that causes a person to endure the incoherent hell that comes with going out into a cold and rainy stadium for 3 hours on a Sunday afternoon and trying to get involved with whatever seems to be happening down there on that far below field. At the Super Bowl, I had the benefit of my usual game day aids, powerful binoculars, and a tiny portable radio for the blizzard of audio details that nobody ever thinks to mention on TV, and a seat on the good left arm of my friend, Mr. Natural. But even with all these aids and a seat on the 50-yard line, I would rather have stayed in my hotel room and watched the goddamn thing on TV. Or maybe in some howling drunk bar full of heavy bettors, the kind of people who like to bet on every play. Pass or run. 3-1 against a first down. 20 to 1 on a turnover. This is a very fast and active style of betting, because you have to make a decision about every 25 seconds. The only thing more intense is betting yes or no on the next shot in something like a pro basketball game between the Celtics and the Knicks, where you might get 5 or 6 shots every 24 seconds, or maybe only one. But in any case, the betting is almost as exhausting as being out there on the floor. I stayed in Houston for 2 days after the game, but even when these things calmed down, I had no luck in finding the people who'd caused me all my trouble. Both Tom Keating and Al Locasale were rumored to be in the vicinity, but, according to some of the New York sports writers who'd seen them, neither one was eager to see me or be seen with me. When I finally fled Houston, it was a cold Tuesday afternoon with big lakes of standing water on the road to the airport. I almost missed my plane to Denver because of a hassle with Jimmy the Greek about who was going to drive us to the airport, and another hassle with the hotel garage man about who was going to pay for 8 days of tending my bogus official Super Bowl car in the hotel garage. And I probably wouldn't have made it at all if I hadn't run into a NFL publicity man who gave me enough speed to jerk me awake and lash the little white Mercury Cougar out along the Dallas freeway to the airport in time to abandon it in the departures taxis only area and hire a man for $5 to rush my bags and sound equipment up to the Continental Airlines desk just in time to make the flight. 24 hours later, I was back in Woody Creek, and finally, by sheer accident, making contact with that twisted bastard Keating, who bent my balance a bit by calmly admitting his role in my problem and explaining it with one of the highest left-handed compliments anybody ever aimed at me. "I got nothing personal against Thompson," he told another NFL player who happened to be skiing in Aspen at the time, "but let's face it, we've got nothing to gain by talking to him. I've read all his stuff, and I know how he is. He's a goddamn lunatic, and you've got to be careful with a bastard like that, because no matter how hard he tries, he just can't help but tell the truth." When I heard that, I just sort of slumped down in my bar stool and stared at myself in the mirror, wishing, on one level, that Keating's harsh judgment was right, but knowing, on another, that the treacherous realities of the worlds I especially work forced me to abandon that purist stance a long time ago. If I'd written all the truth I knew for the past 10 years, about 600 people, including me, would be rotting in prison cells from Rio to Seattle. Absolute truth is a very rare and dangerous commodity in the context of professional journalism. What was easily the most provocative quote of that day, of that whole dreary week, came on the Monday after the game from Miami linebacker Doug Swift. He was talking about his usual loose, "What, me? Worry?" kind of way with 2 or 3 sports writers in the crowded lobby of the Marriott. Buses were leaving for the airport. Dolphin supporters and their wives were checking out. The lobby was full of stranded luggage, and off in one of the corners, Don Shula was talking with another clutch of sports writers and ridiculing the notion that he would ever get rid of Jim Kick. Despite Kick's obvious unhappiness at the prospect of riding the bench again next year behind all-pro running back Mercury Morris. Meanwhile, on the other side of the lobby, Doug Swift was going along with a conversation that had turned, along with Shula's, to money and next year's contracts. Swift listened for a while, then looked up at whoever was talking to him and said, "You can expect to see a lot of new faces on next year's Miami team. A lot of important contracts are coming up for renewal, and you can bet that the guys will be asking for more than management is willing to pay." Nobody paid much attention to the decidedly unnatural timing of Swift's matter-of-fact prediction about a lot of new faces next year, but it was not the kind of talk designed to tickle either Shula's or Joe Roby's rampant humors that morning. Jesus, here was the team's player representative, a star linebacker, and one of the sharpest and most politically conscious people in the league, telling anyone who cared to listen, not even 12 hours after the victory party, that the embryo Dolphin dynasty was already in a very different kind of trouble than anything the Vikings or Redskins had been able to lay on them in 2 straight Super Bowls. Swift's comment was all the more ominous because of his stature as the team's spokesman in the NFL Players Association, a long dormant poker club of sorts that in recent years has developed genuine muscle, even in the face of what most of the player reps called a legalized and unregulated monopoly with the power of what amounts to life or death over their individual fates and financial futures in the tight little world of the National Football League. The Players Association, since 1970, has managed to challenge the owner on a few carefully chosen issues. The 2 most obvious, or at least the most frequently mentioned by players, are the pension fund, which the owners now contribute to about twice as heavily as they did before the threatened strike in 1970, and the players' unilateral rejection last year of the urinalysis proposal, which the owners and Rozelle were apparently ready and willing to arrange for them, rather than risk any more public fights with Congress about things like TV blackouts and antitrust exemptions. According to Pittsburgh tackle Tom Keating, an articulate maverick who seems to enjoy a universal affection and respect from almost everybody in the league, except the owners and owner-bent coaches, the Players Association croaked the idea of mass urinalysis with one quick snarl. "We just told them to fuck it," he says. "The whole concept of mass urine test is degrading. Jesus, can you imagine what would happen if one of those stadium cops showed up in the press box at halftime with 100 test tubes and told all the riders to piss in the damn things or turn in their credentials for the rest of the season? I'd like to film that goddamn scene." I agreed with Keating that mass urinalysis in the press box at halftime would undoubtedly cause violence and a blizzard of vicious assaults on the NFL in the next morning's papers. But after thinking about it for a while, the idea struck me as having definite possibilities if applied on a broad enough basis. Mandatory urine tests for all congressmen and senators at the end of each session, for instance. Who could predict what kind of screaming hell might erupt if Rep. Harley Staggers was suddenly grabbed by 2 Pinkerton men in a hallway of the U.S. Capitol and dragged, in full view of tourists, newsmen, and several dozen of his shocked and frightened colleagues, into a nearby corner and forced to piss in a test tube? Would Staggers scream for help? Would he struggle in the grip of his captors? Or would he meekly submit in the interest of national security? We will probably never know, because the present Congress does not seem to be in a mood to start passing forced urinalysis laws, although the Agnew-style Supreme Court that Nixon has saddled us with would probably look in favor on such a law. In any case, the threat of mandatory urinalysis for professional athletes will probably be hooted out of Congress as some kind of stupid hillbilly joke if Staggers ever gets serious about it. He is not viewed in Washington as a heavy shaker and mover. When Doug Swift made that comment about a lot of new faces on next year's team, he was not thinking in terms of a player revolt against forced urinalysis. What he had in mind, I think, was the fact that among the Dolphin contracts coming up for renewal this year are those of Larry Zonka, Jake Scott, Paul Warfield, Dick Anderson, and Mercury Morris, all established stars earning between $30,000 and $55,000 a year right now, and all apparently in the mood to double their salaries next time around. Which might seem a bit pushy to some people, until you start comparing average salary figures in the National Football League against salaries in other pro sports. The average NFL salary, according to figures provided by Players Association General Counsel Ed Garvey, is $28,500, almost $5,000 less than the $33,000 average for Major League Baseball players, and about half the average salary, between $50,000 and $55,000, in the National Hockey League. But when you start talking about salaries in the National Basketball Association, it's time to kick out the jams. The average NBA salary is $92,500 a year. The NBA Players Association claims that the average salary is $100,000. Against this steep green background, it's a little easier to see why Larry Zonka wants a raise from his current salary of $55,000 to $100,000 or so, a figure that he'd probably scale down pretty calmly if Joe Roby offered him the average NBA salary of $92,500. A quick little sidelight on all these figures has to do with the price TV advertisers paid to push their products during timeouts and penalty squabbles at the Super Bowl. The figure announced by the NFL and whatever TV network carried the goddamn thing was $200,000 per minute. I missed the telecast due to factors beyond my control, which is why I don't know which network sucked up all that gravy, or whether it was Schlitz, Budweiser, Gillette, or even King Kong amyl nitrates that coughed up $200,000 for every 60 seconds of TV exposure on that grim afternoon. But that was just a sidelight. And the longer I look at all these figures, my watch, and this goddamn stinking mojo wire that's been beeping steadily here in the snow for 2 days, the more I tend to see this whole thing about a pending labor management crunch in the NFL as a story with a spine of its own that we should probably leave for later. The only other thing, or maybe two things, that I want to hit, lashing the final pages of this bastard into the mojo, has to do with the sudden and apparent serious formation of the World Football League by the same people whose record, so far, has been pretty good when it comes to taking on big-time monopolies. Los Angeles lawyer Gary Davidson is the same man who put both the American Basketball Association and the World Hockey League together, two extremely presumptuous trips that appear to have worked out very nicely, and which also provided the competition factor that caused the huge salary jumps in both basketball and hockey. Perhaps the best example of how the competition factor affects player salaries comes from the ledger books of the NFL. In 1959, the average salary in pro football was $9,500 a year. But in 1960, when the newly formed AFL began its big money bidding war against pro football's old guard, the average NFL salary suddenly jumped to $27,500. And in the 13 years since then, it has crept up another $1,000 to the current figure of $28,500. The explanation for all this, according to Garvey and all the players I've talked to about it, is rooted entirely in the owner-arranged merger between the NFL and the AFL in 1966. Ever since then, says Garvey, it's been a buyer's market, and that's why the NFL's average salary figure has remained so stagnant compared to the other sports. Garvey said he'd just as soon make any public comment on the possibility of a players' strike next summer, but there is a lot of private talk about it among individual players, and especially among the player reps, and some of the politically oriented hard rockers like Swift, Keating, and Kansas City's Ed Podolak. The only person talking publicly about a players' strike is Gary Davidson, president of the new World Football League, who called a press conference in New York on January 22nd to announce that the WFL was not only going after the top college players and the 35 or so NFL veterans who played out their options last year, but, in a sudden reversal of policy that must have sent cold shots of fear through every one of the 26 plush boardrooms in the NFL, Davidson announced that the WFL will also draft all pro football players, even those under contract, and then begin draining talent out of the NFL by a simple device called future contracts. If the Boston Bulls of the WFL, for instance, decided to draft quarterback Bob Greasy this year and sign him to a future contract for 1975, Greasy would play the entire 74 season for Miami, and then, after getting a certified deposit slip for something like $2 million in gold bullion from his bank in Zurich, he would have a round of farewell beers with Roby and Shula before catching the plane for Boston, where he would open the 1976 season as quarterback for the Bulls. This is only one of several hundred weird scenarios that could start unfolding in the next few months if the NFL franchise owners have enough real money to take advantage of the NFL players' strike that Gary Davidson says he's waiting for this summer. Why not? Total madness on the money front. Huge bonuses. Brutal money raids on NFL teams like the Dolphins and the Raiders. Wild-eyed WFL agents flying around the country in private Lear jets with huge sacks of cash and mind-bending contracts for any player willing to switch. The only sure loser in the end will be the poor bastard who buys a season ticket for the Dolphins' 76th season and then picks up the Miami Herald the next day to find a red banner headline saying, Greasy, Kick, Zonka, Scott, Anderson jump to WFL. Which is sad, but what the hell? None of this tortured bullshit about the future of pro football means anything anyway. If the Red Chinese invaded tomorrow and banned the game entirely, nobody would really miss it after 2 or 3 months. Even now, most of the game is so fucking dull that it's hard to understand how anybody can even watch them on TV unless they have some money hanging on the point spread instead of the final score. Pro football in America is over the hump. 10 years ago, it was a very hip and private kind of vice to be into. I remember going to my first 49er game in 1965 with 15 beers in a plastic cooler and a Dr. Grabow pipe full of bad hash. The 49ers were still playing in Kezar Stadium then, an old gray hulk at the western end of Haight Street in Golden Gate Park. There were never any sellouts, but the 30,000 or so regulars were extremely heavy drinkers, and at least 10,000 of them were out there for no other reason except to get involved in serious violence. By halftime, the place was a drunken madhouse, and anybody who couldn't get it on anywhere else could always go underneath the stands and try to get into the long trough of a men's room. Through the outdoor, there were always a few mean drunks lurking around to punch anybody who tried that. And by the end of the third quarter of any game, regardless of the score, there were always 2 or 3 huge brawls that would require the cops to clear out the whole sections of the grandstand. But all that changed when the 49ers moved out to Candlestick Park. The prices doubled and a whole new crowd took the seats. It was the same kind of crowd I saw last season in the 4 games I went to at the Oakland Coliseum. A sort of half-rich mob of nervous doctors, lawyers, and bank officers who would sit through a whole game without ever making a sound. Not even when some freak with a head full of acid spilled a whole beer down the neck of their gray plastic ski jackets. Towards the end of the season, when the Raiders were battling every week for a spot in the playoffs, some of the players got so pissed off at the stuporous nature of their fans that they began making public appeals for cheering and noise. It was a bad joke if you didn't have to live with it. And as far as I'm concerned, I hope to hell that I never see the inside of another football stadium. Not even a free seat with free booze in the press box. That gig is over now, and I blame it on Vince Lombardi. The success of his Green Bay approach in the 60s restructured the game entirely. Lombardi never really thought about winning. His trip was not losing. Which worked, and because it worked, the rest of the NFL bought Lombardi's whole style. Avoid mistakes, don't fuck up, hang tough, and take no chances. Because sooner or later the enemy will make a mistake, and then you start grinding him down. And if you play the defensive percentages, you'll get inside his 30-yard line at least 3 times in each half. And once you're inside the 30, you want to be sure to get at least 3 points. Wonderful. Who can argue with a battle plan like that? And it is worth remembering that Richard Nixon spent many Sundays during all those long and lonely autumns between 1962 and 68 shuffling around on the field with Vince Lombardi at a Green Bay Packer game. Nixon still speaks of Lombardi as if he might suddenly appear at any moment from underneath one of the larger rocks on the White House lawn, and Don Shula, despite his fairly obvious distaste for Nixon, has adopted the Lombardi style of football so effectively that the Dolphins are now one of the dullest teams to watch in the history of pro football. But most of the others are just as dull, and if you need any proof, find a TV set some weekend that has pro football, basketball, and hockey games on 3 different channels. In terms of pure action and movement, the NFL is a molasses farm compared to the fine sense of crank that comes on when you get locked into watching a team like the Montreal Canadiens or the Boston Celtics. One of the few sharp memories I still have from that soggy week in Houston is the site of the trophy that would go to the team that won the big game on Sunday. It was appropriately named after Vince Lombardi, the Lombardi Trophy, a thick silver fist rising out of a block of black granite. The trophy has all the style and grace of an ice floe in the North Atlantic. There is a silver plaque on one side of the base that says something about Vince Lombardi and the Super Bowl. But the most interesting thing about it is a word that is carved, for no apparent or at least no aesthetic reason, in the top of the black marble base. Discipline. That's all it says, and all it needs to say. The 73 Dolphins, I suspect, will be to pro football what the 64 Yankees were to baseball, the final flower of an era whose time has come and gone. The long and ham-fisted shadow of Vince Lombardi will be on us for many more years, but the crank is gone. Should we end the bugger with that? Why not? Let the sports writers take it from here. And when things get nervous, there's always that smack-filled $7 a night motel room down on the seawall in Galveston. Rolling Stone, number 128, February 15th, 1973.
Yes, sir.
That was it. I love me some Hunter S. Thompson. Enjoy the game, everybody. Tweet at me what you think. It's at Undoctrinated1. Hit us up on Instagram. That's Undoctrinated Podcast. Or email us, and that would be... undoctrinatedpodcast@gmail.com. All right. We'll talk to you later.